We write every word that we say. We are non-corporatized activist media, and we need your help to stay online. Visit patreon.com/actout to become a patron of Activist Independent News. This week on Act Out, what is free speech? What is hate speech? How does academic freedom fit into that and where? And when money is speech, can we the people ever really have free speech? We're diving into that and more, plus some perspectives from the Black left. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. So you may recall from last week that we dissected various legislative attempts to squash free speech, free press, and the right to petition government, i.e. the First Amendment. Well, sort of pulling that red thread into this week, I want to dissect the concept of free speech. It's a phrase that gets thrown around an awful lot, particularly these days, and yet it's one that ends up feeling and sounding hollow. An empty vessel to pour your frustration into, then use as a shield against would-be adversaries. And as we shall see, a big part of this is the digital realm, something that, thanks to net neutrality, allows anyone and everyone to voice their opinions, however horrendous or legitimate they may be. And while I want to see the internet stay open, is there a line to be drawn between opinion and overt threat? When does the legal system step in? When should it? How far does free speech extend into the collegiate world? Academic freedom? What about hate speech versus free speech? And what's to be said against the money bags ironically buying free speech? Should we consider the fact that because we now effectively live in an oligarchy, even such tenets as free speech are for sale to the highest bidder, which is obviously not you or me? Many questions, let's dig for some answers. In the fucked files, it's free speech. In January of this year, Robert Peralta posted a Facebook comment after learning that an activist friend had been choked and slammed by a San Francisco sheriff's deputy outside of City Hall. The post read, "Wow, brother, they want to hit our general. It's time to strike back. Let's burn this motherfucker's house down." Peralta didn't think much about voicing his disgust regarding police brutality, particularly because he actually had no idea who the cop was. Fast forward 2 months, and there was a warrant out for his arrest. The charge? Threatening to kill law enforcement. Peralta proceeded to turn himself in, thinking that it would be a relatively quick discussion to clear up a Facebook post misunderstanding. After all, the original post by his friend said nothing about an officer's identity. It only showed the officer's arms around his friend's neck. Well, he was wrong. He was put in jail with a bail set at $25,000. I'll say that again. $25,000. And while a friend was able to pull together $750 for the initial bail, he's still working to not only get his record clean, but to pay back in installments another $2,500. No small sum for someone on disability. And while I see no mention of whether the actual cop in question has been dealt with for choking an activist, should we applaud the quick reaction of cops to online threats? Not sure? Well, let's flip the story. Again in San Francisco, last July, a man was arrested after posting this picture online. Unlike the previous story, this guy shows a picture of the SFPD police chief Tony Chaplin and suggests beheading him with a good old-fashioned guillotine. Despite the fact that this was a far more overt threat, the case was ultimately thrown out. Public defender Landon Davis convinced a judge to throw it out on free speech grounds. Davis, who is black, by the way, told The Guardian, "As offensive as his statements were, if you look at the entire context, it was completely political." Davis goes on to say that the police are too quick to jump on alleged threats, having no real evidence of explicit danger, but instead pursuing charges because they're offended. They use that as a basis to prosecute someone either they don't agree with or don't like. It can have a huge chilling effect on people's expression online. So that takes it a step further. A threat alone isn't enough to warrant an arrest. It has to be backed up with something more concrete. The problem, of course, is that what constitutes concrete? And should we disregard the fact that Donald Hoganson, the author of that guillotine racist post, is white and Peralta is Hispanic? Race, however, isn't the only factor to consider. Take the case of Chris Wamoff, a Michigan activist who in 2013 was convicted of a felony for his protest of the Enbridge pipeline. He found himself once again in the crosshairs of the legal system when he was charged with a probation violation for posting this on Facebook in early January of 2016. So when y'all are ready to march in and take his ass across the street, I have my torch. I got warm socks. I'm waiting on y'all. The ass he's referring to is Governor Rick Snyder, and his post was directed towards Snyder's grotesque mishandling of the Flint water crisis. Wamoff claims that the across the street refers to jail, which actually does sit across the street from the governor's office. And while the charge was later dropped, Wamoff is not surprised that he was once again targeted. They come after you if you become an activist just for the needs of control. They are going to keep pushing. It's as simple as a bully. Indeed, there have been several cases of police action directed at activist speech. For example, in July of last year, several activists were targeted in Dallas and arrested for criticizing cops on Facebook. Back in Michigan last October, a Detroit resident was slapped with terrorist charges for writing a Facebook post commending the shooters in Dallas who killed 5 cops and wrapping it up with, quote, "kill all white cops." The Attorney General came down hard with one charge of making a terroristic threat and one charge of using a computer to commit a crime, both felonies with a 20-year maximum jail sentence each. So, here we have a myriad of commentary, from racist death threats to suggesting a piece of shit governor go to jail. How should we deal with a never-ending stream of online commentary that, as Peralta pointed out, is easy to post in a matter of seconds? Gone are the days of carefully plotted out threats that required handwritten letters or the actual dialing of a phone number, not to mention getting the phone number and address. Should the guy who sends me poorly spelled rape threats be charged? Should Peralta have been charged? It's a hard line to draw, a slippery slope, and several other idiomatic phrases, but ultimately, if we want to keep free speech intact while also addressing threats, we'll have to do just that. Address them on a case-by-case basis while recognizing the difference between a blurted-out angry statement and a well-thought-out planned threat. As Dan Korobkin, Deputy Legal Director of ACLU Michigan, said, free speech can be disturbing to people and can even appear to encourage illegal conduct. But under clearly established First Amendment rules, unless what someone says is a true threat, a mere generalized statement, particularly in a political context, is protected under the First Amendment. He goes on to say that focusing on threats directed only at police is obviously problematic, and that if the police really feel that there is a legitimate threat against them, then they can and should follow up with questioning to determine whether or not further legal action is required. Makes sense, which is exactly what Peralta thought would happen before he got locked up on $25,000 bail. Now, when it comes to threats directed at people outside the public official or police sphere, it gets a little tricky. Not only because you have to convince the cops that this threat is actually legitimate, but also because cops are rightly distrusted in many communities and could often give two shits whether or not someone they already look down upon is feeling threatened or afraid. In situations like these, activists or targeted groups such as Black, Brown, Indigenous, Undocumented, LGBTQIA, and others often prefer to rely on friends and allies to serve and protect. And while I won't get into a discussion today on community safety and solidarity outside of police intervention, that is also something to consider as our police become more militant, militarized, and aggressive, both physically and when it comes to surveillance and their own threats against community organizers and activists. But again, we will save that commentary for another time. Moving on to more of the world outside of the police purview, what about the collegiate world and the seemingly sacred sphere of intellectual debate? Free speech versus offense and risking your job. On Christmas Eve last year, George Ciccariello-Mayer, an associate professor of politics and global studies at Drexel University, tweeted, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." Ciccariello-Mayer, himself a white man, intended his tweet as a way to blow off steam in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election by poking fun at a mythical belief held by some particularly delusional and awful white people, suggesting that any advancement made by people of color or other oppressed non-whites is really a conspiracy to kill off white people and our way of life. Our way of life being institutional racism, sexism, homophobia, genocide, colonialism, fear, and hate. Fast forward 6 months later, and Ciccariello-Mayer's career still hangs in the balance after his tweet caused some not-so-Merry Christmas mayhem in Breitbart land. Now, hearkening back to our previous commentary on what constitutes a threat, Ciccariello-Mayer's tweet obviously doesn't fall into a direct threat category. And while he's not in danger of being arrested, he is in danger of losing his livelihood. What makes this case particularly interesting, though, is the fact that he is a college professor. Therefore, the issue of academic freedom comes into play. Drexel University bases its academic freedom policy on the American Association of University Professors Guidelines, which states that faculty members should remember that the public may judge their profession and their institution by their utterances. They should at all times be accurate, should exercise appropriate restraint, should show respect for the opinions of others, and should make every effort to indicate that they are not speaking for the institution. I disagree with some of that, but anyway, that being said, Greg Schultz, Director of Tenure, Academic Freedom, and Governance at the AAUP, noted that this guideline is followed by a long footnote dictating that the controlling principle is that a professor's personal expression of opinion cannot constitute grounds for dismissal unless it clearly demonstrates the faculty member's unfitness for his or her position, and that extramural utterances rarely bear upon the faculty member's fitness for the position. So, for example, if a science teacher is saying that climate change isn't a real thing, they could be fired on professional grounds having nothing to do with their academic freedom or free speech, but instead their ability to actually do their job accurately, i.e., teach science. But if a science teacher tweets something about gay marriage, pro or con, he or she has a right to be stupid. To quote my father, Dr. David Goldfield, who is also a college professor, professors should be given the broadest latitude, even if that extends into stupidity. As a professor of Southern history at UNC Charlotte, he says, "I tell my students at the beginning of every semester, I hope that I make you uncomfortable." And in Charlotte, North Carolina, as a hard leftist, my guess is that's probably not too difficult. But the point is that professors and intellectuals should be pushing buttons. They should be asking uncomfortable questions that make us think, for example, what the fuck is white genocide? And the reason is that if we can create confined lanes for our intellectuals to operate in, our minds will become narrower and narrower as a result. If we only allow our academics to operate in what some higher authority deems appropriate niches, our academic evolution will stall. And that is why academic freedom is particularly important. Now, speaking of colleges, it's important to make a distinction between the right to free speech and the right to have a platform for that speech, particularly when you're being bankrolled by the 1%. You may have heard about the putrid piles of human feces Milo Yiannopoulos, Ann Coulter, Richard Spencer, and eugenicist Charles Murray being invited to speak at colleges around the U.S. And while the mainstream media would have you believe that they are invited to speak by a college's Young Republican Club or something similar, these speaking tours are actually pure astroturf. They are funded by non-profits operated by the same wealthy billionaires whose money destroys both society and the planet. As revealed by Alex Koch in an April investigation for Alternet, bankrolling these nonprofits are conservative mega-donors including Charles and David Koch and the DeVos family, who by funding the organizations enable hate speech at institutions of higher education. That's right, the very same Koch brothers that brought us Citizens United and the DeVos family, who brought us Trump's incompetent Secretary of Education, the sister of Blackwater founder Eric Prince, are seeking to promote bigotry on campuses while simultaneously undermining academic freedom. And now this all really calls back to the Powell Memo, a corporate call to arms written by Associate Justice to the Supreme Court Lewis Powell on the trend against both conservative politics and the capitalist economy rising in American media, schools, and the streets. In the memo, he offers up several suggestions, including an activist-minded Supreme Court that would take the side of businesses in case dealings. But with regards to college campuses specifically, you may recognize some parallels between today and his suggestions from more than 45 years ago. The assault on the enterprise system was not mounted in a few months. Although origins, sources, and causes are complex and interrelated, there is reason to believe that the campus is the single most dynamic source. Organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce can assist and activate constructive change in many ways, including the following. Staff of scholars. The Chamber should consider establishing a staff of highly qualified scholars in the social sciences who do believe in the system. Staff of speakers. Speakers Bureau Evaluation of Textbooks. As Orwellian as some of that may sound, the question that crops up time and again is, why don't universities just slough off this corporate college takeover and turn away all the dirty money in order to avoid platforming fascist speakers? Well, because the 1%ers funding these tours and this insidious redefinition of free speech are connected. With public education budgets slashed, our nation's universities are now dependent on many of the same right-wing donors and corporations to stay afloat. And as an investigative article in The Atlantic earlier this year asked, can academic researchers remain impartial if they are beholden to corporate money? Let me go ahead and answer that for you. No. And when money dictates academic research, it's not just impartiality that dies, it is in fact academic freedom. Furthermore, even if we were to ignore the money scheme, which we totally shouldn't, the First Amendment guarantees that the government won't shut down your speech. It does not guarantee you a platform at schools or in the newspaper to spread your hateful and wrong-headed beliefs. Just like free speech doesn't mean that I have a fucking right to walk into somebody's home and start spouting hateful shit at them. Spencer Coulter and their gaggle of fascist goons are still free to spout their hate speech, to be assholes, to tweet, to write, to speak out and share their mental diarrhea with their brainwashed fans, but they do not have the constitutional right to access any platform to do so. And to use money to shove these messages of hate and fear into schools around the country is not free speech. It is quite literally paid speech and something not at all protected under the First Amendment. Just as anti-corporatocracy activists have said for years, money is not speech. Because if it is, the person with the most money has the most speech, and then it is no longer, by definition, free speech. In summation, even though, as a new research study suggests, the free speech argument gets used a lot for racists defending racists, they still have the right to not only free speech, but the right to wrongly defend it based on prejudice, not principle. As Mark H. White, a graduate student in psychology at the University of Kansas, wrote in his and his professor Christian Crandall's findings, we think of principles as ideas that we use to guide behavior in our everyday lives. Our data show something different, that we tend to make up our mind on something based on our attitudes, in this case, racial attitudes, and then decide that the principle is relevant or irrelevant. People do whatever best fits their pre-existing attitudes. White goes on to write that their study showed a significant drop in the free speech defense when the speech was directed towards public authority, or even just random people in a coffee shop, with no racial connotation. The researchers found that the prejudiced subjects were more inclined to stand up for the racist comments because they felt that their own freedom of expression is questioned in today's society. And while researchers pointed out that, of course, not everyone who defends free speech is racist, it is important to recognize a difference between an actual valuation of the idea versus using it as a go-to defense. We should not ignore the free speech defense, but we shouldn't assume that the motives are purely based on an abstract democratic principle. Ultimately, we all fall victim to defending our perspectives, using whatever we might be able to grab onto in order to bolster an ideology or dearly held concept. Again, this is why I think that we should all try to avoid isms altogether, releasing these ideological buoys in order to tread water in a more fluid mental state, one that is open to new information and facts. And in that same vein, while the concept of free speech is still somewhat abstract, as a tenet first jotted down in 1789, not really a bad idea to keep it malleable. Obviously, digital trolling wasn't a thing back in the day, and as Thomas Paine warned, we must be sure to avoid the dangers of a political atom, making decisions for all of posterity to live by. It is the right, and indeed the duty, of each new generation to define how it wants to live, how it wants to govern. And as hate speech rises, we can and should make a distinction between paid speech and free speech. Open platforms, i.e. a street corner, versus closed platforms, i.e. universities and media outlets. We can work and form this principle so that activists can't be locked up for a Facebook post, for CrimethInc, so that professors aren't sacked for an impulsive tweet. We can work to combat the creeping authoritarianism peppered in Powell's memo through free speech and free press and petitioning our government, i.e. protest. We can turn our backs on the racist 1%. We can protect our campuses from fascists, and we can spread the word that while racists and bigots have the right to speech, they do not have the right to act. And we will fight that hate. We will protect each other and our communities, mentally and physically, because that is our right. Now, carrying on with some of the speech tip, we sat down with Margaret Kimberly, columnist for Black Agenda Report, to talk about the nebulously defined left, allyship, the democratic deception, and more, all from the perspective of the Black left. Take a look.
Well, the Black left is, we're trying to differentiate ourselves. And, the word left, words like left and right are used so strangely in the United States. There are people who are just Democrats who like to call themselves leftists. I think it's fair to say that those of us on the Black Agenda Report team are all socialists to some degree or other. We are opposed to the carceral state, opposed to the military-industrial complex, to interventions around the world. And those are things that do not change for any of us. And this is a very proud tradition. Black Americans have always led in the fight for human rights, their own and for other people. And we have lost that in this rightward lurch, in our so-called leaders, as we call them, the Black misleadership class, such as elected officials and others who used to be stalwarts in the issues that I've discussed, but now depend on patronage or on staying in office. And, it used to be before Obama was elected, Black people used to talk about the possibility. Could it ever happen? Would it ever happen that we would see a Black president? And I started to think about it, and I said, well, considering what you have to do to become president, is this something I would want to see? Presidents, nobody gets that job who is not beholden to corporate interests, not beholden to the military-industrial complex, and to have a person like that, but just with brown skin, was not something that I found appealing in the slightest. In addition to that, in order to be elected presidents, there has to be a distancing from Black America, from our needs. So Republicans, Democrats all find ways to either ignore us or to overtly attack us. And Obama was no different in that regard, with his constant scolding, with his criticisms of Black people. He said things that a white person would never have been able to get away with.
Right. It's sort of like, people say, oh, isn't it great that Lockheed Martin has a female CEO? And my response is no, I think it's awful.
That seems to be a quality in this country when marginalized groups get to be as horrible as white men used to be.
Right.
Used to be reserved for them.
So talk about from your perspective, white allyship and the recognition of privilege, whether that be recognizing the harm in elitist feminism like Hillary Clinton, or the work that we need to do as whites in our own communities, battling the rise of white supremacy and vigilante violence. What do you think, like from the perspective of the Black left, what does the white left need to do to build that allyship and real solidarity?
Just really be left. I would think, if people are truly left, then they won't be hoodwinked by, I mean, Hillary Clinton and feminism. I mean, really, she's ready to, she was ready to push abortion rights under the bus. So, it's just her, having an XX chromosome as opposed to XY didn't make her an ally of women. So I think it's if the white left are truly the left. I think that will do it. As far as calling oneself an ally, I don't know. It's a tricky word. Probably best to ditch it, or just say an ally, or just say comrades. Um, if you're going to be a white ally, you've got to be an ally like John Brown was, who lost his life and sparked the Civil War, which it's a good thing he did. But I think people should be less concerned about being allies and more concerned about really being on the left. And I think if people are truly on the left, then they are inherently allies and willing to listen to other people. At the same time, we do have different experiences, and I think people need to just admit to themselves that they cannot speak for other people. Nobody should be speaking for anybody else. Men can't speak for women. White people can't speak for not white people, et cetera, et cetera. But just be on the left and be a comrade, and be willing to do. If you're going to call yourself an ally of a group, you've got to really be willing to fight.
For more on Margaret Kimberly's work, visit blackagendareport.com and her own blog at freedomwriter.blogspot.com. And that'll do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.